One of the most important aspects of a functioning justice system is the public's belief that it actually works. And as true crime fans, we tend to see many examples of this in action, but sadly that isn't always the case. Be it someone getting away with a crime due to police incompetence, or that person not receiving nearly as long of a prison sentence as they realistically should have, there are unfortunately endless examples of the justice system failing. And that's not even to mention some of the more politically charged situations, such as police shootings. One of the most egregious failings of the justice system, though, is when an innocent person is sent to prison for a crime they didn't commit. It is one of those nightmare scenarios that each and every one of us hopes we never have to experience. But the sad truth is there are many who have, and some who have lost almost their entire life due to this grave misjustice. On April 25, 1978, police in Kansas City, Missouri were called to a home where 3 people had been horrifically murdered. 22-year-old Sherry Black, 21-year-old Larry Ingram, and 20-year-old John Walker had all been tied up and shot to death in an apparent home invasion that had turned deadly. A 4th victim named Cynthia Douglas, who was Mr. Ingram's girlfriend, had managed to survive after playing dead while the assailants ransacked the house. Because of this, she didn't get a very good look at them, which will become very important later on. She did, however, note there were 4 perpetrators in total. The next morning, police detained a man who lived near the crime scene by the name of Kevin Strickland, believing the 18-year-old had possibly been involved. 2 other men by the names of Kilm Adkins and Vincent Bell, who were friends of Strickland and also believed to be involved, were on the run, while the search for the 4th suspect continued. Mr. Strickland insisted that he hadn't been involved with the shooting whatsoever, and was home at the time it took place watching TV and talking on the phone. This story was corroborated by Kevin's family and the person he spoke with. As far as his friendship with Bell and Atkins was concerned, he said he had seen them earlier that day, but had no idea what they had gotten into after he left. Despite this, he was detained as a possible suspect. A couple of days later, police located and arrested Kilm Adkins and Vincent Bell. A shotgun was recovered from Bell's home that was also identified as the murder weapon, which contained an unknown set of fingerprints that police believed to be from the 4th suspect. Searching Bell's vehicle, they found a set of fingerprints that belonged to Kevin Strickland. The 2 were childhood friends, and Mr. Strickland said that his fingerprints were only found in the car because he had driven it before. None of the fingerprints at the crime scene could be linked to him, and as I mentioned previously, the fingerprints on the murder weapon didn't match him either. Despite this, he was placed under arrest and charged with murder along with both Adkins and Bell. At this point, Kevin was understandably confident these charges wouldn't stick. He had an alibi that proved he was home at the time of the murder took place. There was no physical evidence linking him to the crime scene aside from a fingerprint in Bell's car which could be easily explained, and he knew Cynthia personally, so he was confident there was no way she'd identify him as one of the assailants. To his shock, though, when presented with a police lineup, Cynthia not only ID'd Adkins and Bell, but also Kevin. Years later, she would confess that she was pressured by detectives to select Kevin out of a lineup, and would advocate for his release for the remainder of her life. But for now, Mr. Strickland found himself headed to trial for multiple murder charges. Both Adkins and Bell would cut deals with prosecutors and plead guilty. However, in their confessions, they insisted that Kevin was not involved. Despite this, Strickland's trial proceeded, and a year after his arrest ended in a hung jury, with the only African-American juror being the lone holdout on finding Kevin guilty. Strickland was absolutely stunned. Even leading up to all of this, he believed there was no way he would ever come close to being convicted for a crime that he knew he hadn't committed. Yet he ended up being just one juror away from conviction, with a second trial soon looming. In one of the more shocking parts of this story, Kevin said that after the hung jury was announced, the state's attorney at the time walked over to him and his lawyer and said, quote, "I'll make sure this doesn't happen again." When Kevin's second trial began a few months later, it was an all-white jury, and the verdict was a unanimous guilty on all counts. The then 20-year-old was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole for 50 years. Kevin would spend the next 4 decades in jail. His only attempted appeal was rejected by the Missouri Supreme Court in 1980. And in a horrific twist of irony, Adkins and Bell, who actually had physical evidence linking them to the crime scene and had confessed their involvement, received just 20-year sentences and would end up being released after 10. Kevin and his family continued to maintain his innocence, but very little traction was gained in the way of appeals. Then in the early 1990s, Cynthia Douglas, whose eyewitness account had likely been the deciding factor in Kevin's guilt, began advocating for his release, saying that she had only picked him out of the lineup because she was pressured to do so by police. She would maintain this position until she passed away in 2015. Despite Kevin and his family continuing to fight his case, no progress was made until 2020, when the Kansas City Star did an editorial discussing what had happened and the circumstances around Kevin's conviction. By now, he was in his 60s and needed the assistance of a wheelchair to get around. He had suffered multiple heart attacks, and his father had died in 2011, still fighting for his son to be free, with his elderly mother praying she could see her son's release before the end of her life. The Star's report prompted a review from the Jackson County District Attorney's Office, who concurred with the newspaper's opinion that Strickland's arrest had been unjust and petitioned for his release. This prompted an outcry from everyone across the political spectrum within Missouri politics, which included the mayor of Kansas City and over a dozen lawmakers from the state's House of Representatives. Armed with this new support and a new legal team that had taken up Mr. Strickland's case, a petition was sent to the Missouri Supreme Court to order Strickland's release. Sadly, though, this petition was rejected in June of 2021. The next attempt was to try and get the current governor of Missouri, Mike Parson, to issue a pardon. However, in August of 2021, Parson issued a statement saying that he would not pardon Strickland, as he was unsure of his innocence and didn't view the case as a priority. To add salt to the wound, Kevin's mother passed away shortly after this announcement, not surviving to see her son finally freed. At this point, all hope seemed lost, and a despondent Kevin even stated in interviews that he wasn't sure how much time he had left, as his medical problems had grown severe. In November of 2020, though, his lawyers successfully secured a hearing with a judge, where they were able to argue in favor of reversing the verdict. Over the course of 3 days, Strickland's lawyers presented their case, and on the 23rd of November, Judge James Walsh issued his ruling, saying, quote, "Under these unique circumstances, the court's confidence in Strickland's conviction is so undermined that it cannot stand, and the judgment of conviction must be set aside. The state of Missouri shall immediately discharge Kevin Bernard Strickland from its custody." After 43 years in prison, Kevin Strickland was finally a free man. Though he is now out of prison, nothing can give Kevin back the 40-plus years he lost as a result of this wrongful conviction. With no job history and a slew of medical problems, Kevin's prospects for employment are very slim, and unfortunately the state of Missouri only allows financial compensation for cases where the defendant was exonerated by DNA. In order to help Kevin out, His lawyers have set up a GoFundMe for him, which at the time of recording this video has netted close to $2 million in donations. And if you have the means, I would highly encourage you to donate. Since they are registered as gifts, they don't incur the same tax burden as earned income, meaning Kevin will get to keep most, if not all, of the money. Nothing can give Mr. Strickland back all those lost years and a life that was unjustly destroyed by a corrupt justice system in Missouri. But your donation could go a long way in making the remaining years of his life a lot easier. And if anyone has earned that right, it is Kevin Strickland. This is Crime Spot, and thank you for watching.